You're sitting there right now thinking you've got your crew figured out. Your buddy from the gym, your neighbor who's into camping, maybe your cousin who was in the National Guard for 6 months. You've had the conversations over beers about when things go bad, and everyone nodded along like they're actually going to show up when the power grid collapses. But let me ask you something. When 99% of people are 3 days away from complete chaos without their supply chain, when grocery stores are empty and ATMs are dark, how many of those people you're counting on are going to choose you over their own family? How many of them have skills worth the food they'll eat? How many of them are going to crack under pressure when things get real? Here's what I know with absolute certainty. Most survival groups are a fantasy held together by barbecue small talk and YouTube comment sections. They're built on friendships, not function. They're assembled based on who you like, not who you need. And when the systems fail, when there's no 911 to call and no resupply coming, those groups implode faster than a vacuum seal on a cheap storage container. I've studied the sociology. I've run the scenarios. I've watched communities form and collapse in disaster zones from Katrina to the Balkans. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The optimal survival community isn't 10 people. It isn't 20. And it sure as hell isn't the 40-person compound fantasy you've been masturbating to. It's 5. 5 specific roles. 5 people who understand that survival isn't about friendship, it's about function. Today I'm going to show you exactly why most teams fail, and I'm going to give you the precise structure that actually works. Not Hollywood nonsense, not Walking Dead romance. The actual mathematical and logistical framework for a sustainable post-collapse community. I'm going to tell you which 5 roles are non-negotiable, how to vet people for them, and why anything larger than 5 is a death sentence in the first 6 months. Forget the prepper fantasy of the big happy compound where everyone shares everything and nobody argues. That's a cult, not a community, and cults collapse the moment the charismatic leader gets dysentery or takes a ricochet. What I'm about to lay out is based on actual anthropology, actual military unit cohesion research, and actual case studies from societies that survived complete system collapse. You can keep scrolling and stick with your current plan, which is probably no plan at all, just a list of names and some vague promises. Or you can spend the next 22 minutes learning the structure that gives you exponentially better odds than the 99% who think survival is a popularity contest. Your choice. If you want to be part of the fraction of a percent who actually builds something that lasts, hit subscribe. Drop a comment with your biggest concern about team dynamics in a collapse scenario. Let's get tactical. Here's why your current group is going to fail. It's too big, it's too loose, and it's built on the wrong foundation. You've got 8 people, maybe 12, all claiming they're committed. Half of them have never missed a meal in their lives. A quarter of them are on prescription medications they haven't stockpiled. And not one of them has thought through the actual mathematics of resource consumption versus production in a collapse scenario. Let me paint you a picture. The grid goes down. Doesn't matter why. EMP, cyber attack, cascading infrastructure failure. Your 12-person group converges on the location you've talked about. Everyone shows up, which is already statistically unlikely, but let's be generous. You've got food for what, 3 months if you're lucky? 6 months if you've been serious about it? Here's the physics problem nobody wants to discuss. 12 people consume 12 times the resources, but 12 people don't produce 12 times the value. They don't multiply your security, they multiply your exposure. They don't multiply your skills, they multiply your redundancy and conflict. Every additional person is another mouth that needs feeding, another personality that needs managing, another medical liability, another set of family members who might show up begging for help. The mathematics of group survival follow a law of diminishing returns that becomes negative past a certain threshold. 1 person alone has a terrible survival probability. 2 people, if they're the right 2 people, multiply effectiveness significantly. 3 people can cover basic security rotations. 4 people can start to specialize. 5 people hit the optimal balance of skill diversity, resource efficiency, and manageable group dynamics. But 6, 7, 12? You're now managing a bureaucracy. You need formal leadership structures. You need conflict resolution protocols. You need systems for resource allocation that feel fair enough that nobody decides to take their share and bounce. You've turned survival into governance, and governance requires surplus resources you don't have. Here's what the anthropologists figured out decades ago studying hunter-gatherer bands and military unit cohesion. The optimal size for a high-trust, high-function working group under stress is between 4 and 7 people. Below 4, you lack critical redundancy. Above 7, you start forming factions and subgroups. At 5, you hit what's called the functional minimum with optimal cohesion. 5 people can maintain direct relationships with all other members. That's 10 total relationship pairs. Everyone knows everyone else's capabilities, limitations, and psychological state. There's no us versus them because there's no room for factions. There's no anonymous free riders because everyone's contribution is visible. There's no diffusion of responsibility because roles are clear and non-overlapping. This isn't theory. This is pattern recognition from every successful small unit operation in military history, every functional explorer expedition, every sustainable commune that lasted more than 5 years. 5 is the number where individual accountability meets collective resilience, where specialization becomes possible without redundancy becoming wasteful, where trust can be maintained without formal hierarchy becoming necessary. Now let's talk about why most groups fail even when they stumble into the right size. They pick the wrong people. They choose based on affinity, not ability. They select for who they like drinking with, not who they need bleeding with. They build teams around friendship instead of function, and friendship is a luxury that evaporates the moment someone's kid is hungry and your storage locker has food. Here's the framework that works. 5 roles, 5 non-negotiable specializations. Each person is the primary expert in their domain, with secondary competencies that overlap strategically. No redundancy of primary roles because you can't afford to feed backup quarterbacks. No gaps in critical capabilities because gaps get people killed. This is workforce optimization under scarcity conditions, not a social club. Role number 1, the engineer, the builder, the person who understands mechanical systems, structural integrity, and practical physics. This is not your buddy who's handy. This is someone who can fabricate solutions from scrap, who understands load-bearing principles, who can repair and modify critical systems without a Home Depot down the street. The engineer maintains infrastructure, water collection and filtration, power generation if you've got solar or hydro, structural fortification and repair. They understand material properties well enough to know what's salvageable and what's liability. They can look at a building and tell you which walls you can breach and which ones hold up the roof. They can assess whether a bridge will carry weight or collapse. Here's what makes a good engineer irreplaceable. They think in systems. They don't just fix the immediate problem, they understand how the fix affects the downstream dependencies. They know that plumbing isn't just about water flow, it's about pressure, about contamination vectors, about thermal expansion. They know that structural modification isn't just about making a hole in a wall, it's about load redistribution and progressive collapse scenarios. Your engineer needs to be someone who's worked with their hands professionally, not hobbyist level. Professional tradesman, industrial maintenance tech, field engineer, someone who's been problem-solving under pressure with limited resources their entire career. Someone who understands that, in a collapse scenario, every repair has to last because there's no replacing it next week. The vetting question for an engineer. Give them a broken system and scrap materials and watch how they approach the problem. Do they improvise? Do they understand principles or just memorize procedures? Can they explain their reasoning? Do they consider second and third order effects? The engineer who can jury-rig a water pump from a car alternator and PVC pipe is worth their weight in antibiotics. Role number 2, the medic. And I don't mean someone who took a weekend first aid course. I mean someone with actual medical training. EMT certification minimum. Paramedic better. Nurse or physician's assistant better still. Someone who's put hands on trauma, who's maintained life under pressure, who understands human physiology beyond apply pressure and call 911. Because here's the reality nobody wants to discuss. Medical care is the limiting factor in long-term survival. Not food, not water, not security. Medical. A simple infection becomes a death sentence without antibiotics. A broken bone becomes permanent disability without proper setting. Appendicitis becomes sepsis becomes a corpse without surgical intervention. Your medic maintains the health of the group, which means they're maintaining your productive capacity. They handle everything from minor injuries to major trauma to preventive care. They understand medication protocols, they can suture wounds, they can recognize and treat shock, infection, malnutrition, dehydration. They're your diagnostic expert for everything from broken bones to mysterious illnesses. Here's what separates a real medic from a first aid enthusiast. They can make triage decisions. They understand that in resource scarcity conditions, not everyone can be saved, and they can make the call about who gets the last dose of antibiotics. They can perform procedures that are illegal or unethical in normal society because normal society no longer exists. They can amputate if that's what saves a life. The vetting question for a medic: what's their actual hands-on experience with trauma? With prolonged care without hospital backup? Can they talk you through a cricothyrotomy if that's what's needed? Do they have a stocked pharmacy with the essential medications? Do they understand resource allocation under scarcity? The medic who's worked in battlefield conditions or rural areas without advanced medical infrastructure is gold. Role number 3, the provisioner, the forager, the person who understands food systems, preservation, and resource acquisition. This is not your friend who likes to hunt. This is someone who understands sustainable food production, who can identify hundreds of edible and medicinal plants, who knows preservation techniques beyond throwing things in a freezer that no longer works. The provisioner manages food security, which means they're managing survival itself. They maintain gardens or hydroponic systems. They know how to forage wild edibles without poisoning anyone. They understand hunting and trapping at a level that's sustainable, not the weekend warrior who bags a deer once a year. They know fishing, both passive traps and active techniques. They understand food preservation through canning, smoking, drying, fermenting, all the methods that don't require electricity. Here's what makes a provisioner critical. They think in calories and nutrition, not just meals. They understand that you need roughly 2,000 calories per day for maintenance, more for heavy physical labor, and they can calculate group needs against production capacity. They know that protein is your limiting nutrient, that vitamin deficiencies kill slowly but surely, that carbohydrates are easy, but micronutrients require diversity. Your provisioner needs to be someone who's lived close to the land. Homesteader, commercial fisherman, forester, wildlife biologist, someone who understands ecosystems and sustainable harvesting. Someone who knows that overhunting your area means starvation next year. Someone who can look at terrain and identify the resources available by season. The vetting question for a provisioner: can they feed 5 people for a month using only what's available in a 10-mile radius? Do they know which plants are edible and which ones will kill you? Can they preserve meat without refrigeration? Do they understand crop rotation and soil depletion? The provisioner who's actually lived off-grid for extended periods is worth more than all your freeze-dried meals combined. Role number 4, the guardian, the tactician, the person who understands security, threat assessment, and defensive operations. This is not your cousin who owns a bunch of guns and plays Call of Duty. This is someone with actual tactical training. Military, law enforcement, private security, someone who's operated in hostile environments and understands that violence is a tool, not a fantasy. The Guardian maintains operational security. They assess threats. They establish defensive perimeters. They create patrol schedules and early warning systems. They understand ballistics and cover versus concealment. They know how to spot surveillance and counter-surveillance. They can make threat assessments based on human behavior, not paranoia. Here's what separates a real Guardian from a gun collector. They understand that security is about deterrence and de-escalation first, violence last. They know that every confrontation you avoid is resources saved and injuries prevented. They understand fields of fire and dead space. They can teach the rest of the group basic defensive tactics without turning them into soldiers. Your Guardian thinks in concentric rings of security. Outer perimeter for early warning, middle perimeter for deterrence, inner perimeter for defense. They understand that passive defenses, obstacles, sightlines, and lighting are more valuable than active patrols. They know when to engage and when to withdraw. The vetting question for a Guardian: how do they handle ambiguity and de-escalation? Can they assess whether someone's a threat or a refugee? Do they default to aggression or to information gathering? Do they understand that killing someone means dealing with a body, a moral weight, and potential retaliation? The Guardian with actual combat experience who's also seen the aftermath is the one you want. Role number 5, the coordinator, the administrator, the person who manages logistics, rationing, work schedules, and group cohesion. This is your most underrated role, the one everyone forgets about, and it's the reason most groups implode. Because survival isn't just about having skills, it's about coordinating those skills into sustained productivity. The coordinator handles everything that isn't covered by the other 4 roles but is essential to function. They maintain inventory and rationing schedules. They track consumption rates against production. They assign daily tasks and ensure equitable work distribution. They mediate conflicts before they become fractures. They maintain morale, which is a quantifiable survival factor. Here's why you need a dedicated coordinator. The other 4 roles are high-stress specializations that consume mental bandwidth. Your engineer is thinking about structural problems. Your medic is managing health crises. Your provisioner is calculating food scarcity. Your guardian is assessing threats. Nobody has bandwidth left to manage group dynamics, schedule optimization, and fair resource allocation. Your coordinator is the person with administrative experience, organizational skills, and emotional intelligence. Project manager, operations manager, someone who's coordinated complex logistics under pressure. Someone who can make unpopular decisions, like cutting someone's ration because they're not pulling weight, without destroying group cohesion. The vetting question for a coordinator: how do they handle conflict and scarcity decisions? Can they make trade-offs transparent and defensible? Do they track metrics and adjust plans based on data? Can they identify when someone's struggling before it becomes a crisis? The coordinator who's managed teams through actual hardship is your social glue. Now here's where it gets critical. These 5 roles don't overlap in primary function, but they must overlap in secondary skills. Your engineer needs basic medical knowledge. Your medic needs to understand structural safety. Your provisioner needs basic tactical awareness. Your guardian needs to understand rationing psychology. Your coordinator needs working knowledge of all 4 other domains. Because here's the dark truth. You're going to lose people. Illness, injury, death, or defection. A 5-person team can survive becoming 4 if everyone has secondary competencies. It cannot survive if your only medic dies and nobody else knows how to treat an infection. Cross-training isn't optional, it's insurance. The structure that works is weekly skill-sharing sessions. 2 hours where each specialist teaches the others their fundamental principles. Not enough to replace them, but enough to limp along if they're incapacitated. Your engineer teaches basic repairs. Your medic teaches wound care and medication protocols. Your provisioner teaches plant identification. Your guardian teaches perimeter awareness. Your coordinator teaches inventory management. This cross-training serves another purpose. It builds respect and eliminates hierarchy conflict. When everyone understands how difficult each role is, when everyone's tried to suture a wound or fabricate a part from scrap, the ego battles evaporate. Respect becomes functional, not political. Now let's talk about what kills most groups even when they have the right structure and the right people. They don't test the system before they need it. They have plans, they have roles, but they've never actually executed under stress. They've never spent a week living as if the collapse already happened. They've never discovered which parts of their plan are fantasy until it's too late to adapt. Here's your mandate. Run quarterly exercises. Full 72-hour scenarios where you operate as if systems are down. No electricity from the grid, no resupply, no outside contact. You eat only what you've stored or can produce. You handle simulated emergencies, medical scenarios, security breaches, resource conflicts. You stress test every system and every person. These exercises do 2 things. First, they expose failures in planning when the stakes are low. You discover that your water filtration takes twice as long as you calculated. You realize your rationing schedule doesn't account for high exertion days. You find out which person cracks under pressure or which person steps up unexpectedly. Second, they build the muscle memory and group coordination that makes actual crisis response automatic instead of panicked. When everyone knows their role and has practiced it repeatedly, when you've already had the arguments about work distribution and figured out the compromises, the actual emergency becomes easier because you're executing a known playbook. The testing protocol is non-negotiable. If someone won't commit to quarterly exercises, they're not committed to the group. If someone shows up to exercises but doesn't take them seriously, they're a liability. This is where you vet for actual commitment versus theoretical agreement. This is where you discover who's real and who's LARPing. And here's the part nobody wants to hear. You need an exit protocol. A written agreement that if someone leaves the group, whether by choice or by vote, they leave with exactly what they brought and nothing more. No share of group supplies, no access to group locations, no retained knowledge of group security measures. This sounds harsh until you consider the alternative. A disgruntled ex-member who knows where you are and what you have is an existential threat. The social dynamics of a 5-person group are manageable but not automatic. You need explicit agreements on decision-making. Consensus is ideal but paralyzing in crisis. You need a tiered system, routine decisions by role specialist, major decisions by group vote, emergency decisions by whoever's handling the crisis with after-action review. You need conflict resolution protocols before you need them. Arguments will happen. Personality conflicts will emerge. Resource competition will create tension. The protocol that works: structured conversation with the coordinator as mediator, focus on behavior and impact rather than character, commitment to solutions rather than blame, and the nuclear option of group vote for removal if someone becomes toxic. Here's the metric that matters. Can your group sustain indefinitely without external input? If you're consuming faster than producing, you're on a countdown to failure. If you're producing surplus, you're building resilience. Your coordinator should be tracking this weekly. Calories consumed versus calories produced, medical supplies used versus medical supplies preserved, defensive materials degraded versus defensive materials maintained. The groups that survive aren't the ones with the most guns or the biggest stockpile. They're the ones with sustainable production capacity and functional social cohesion. They're the ones who've built a system where 5 people can do the work of 20 because they're optimized, trained, and coordinated. They're the ones who've accepted that survival is labor, not luxury, and structured accordingly. Now let me give you the reconnaissance tasks you should be executing right now. Open a new tab. Start a document. Title it Team Assessment. List every person you're currently considering for your group. Next to each name, write which of the 5 roles they could fill, and be honest about whether they actually have the skills or just the interest. Next task, identify gaps. If you don't have a qualified medic, that's your critical vulnerability. Start networking in medical communities, EMT courses, nursing forums. If you don't have a real engineer, start looking at tradesman networks, makerspaces, industrial maintenance workers. Build relationships now while it's low stakes. Third task, design your vetting process. Create specific exercises for each role. For your engineer candidate, give them a repair problem with limited tools. For your medic, run trauma scenarios. For your provisioner, send them into the woods with a field guide and see what they come back with. For your guardian, discuss tactical scenarios and assess their reasoning. For your coordinator, give them a complex scheduling problem with resource constraints. Fourth task, schedule your first exercise. Pick a weekend 3 months out. Make it non-negotiable for everyone who's serious. Design scenarios that test each role and the interfaces between them. Simulate equipment failures, medical emergencies, security breaches, food scarcity. Document everything that fails so you can fix it before it matters. Fifth task, draft your agreements. Roles and responsibilities, decision-making protocols, conflict resolution procedures, resource contribution and allocation, departure terms. Get everyone to read it, discuss it, and sign it. This isn't about legal enforceability, it's about making expectations explicit before resentment builds. Let me be absolutely clear about something. This structure doesn't make you invincible. Nothing makes you invincible. You can have the perfect 5-person team with optimal skills and still get wiped out by bad luck, overwhelming force, or a pandemic that doesn't care about your preparations. But you're playing probabilities, not guarantees. And 5 functional people organized correctly have exponentially better odds than 12 dysfunctional people organized around friendship. The hard truth is that most people reading this won't actually do any of this. They'll keep their oversized fantasy group of untested buddies. They'll keep believing that goodwill and general competence are enough. They'll keep waiting for a crisis to reveal whether their team actually works, and by then it's too late to fix it. The 1% who actually build structured teams will separate from the 99% who talk about it in the first week of a collapse. The 0.1% who test and iterate that structure will survive the first month when the talkers are already dead. This is the difference between people who prepare and people who pretend to prepare. Your move is this. You can close this video and go back to pretending your current plan is fine, or you can open that document right now and start the honest assessment. You can keep collecting gear and stockpiling food while ignoring the social structure that determines whether you get to keep it, or you can build the team architecture that actually multiplies your survival probability. You've got the framework, 5 roles, 5 people, cross-training, testing, protocols. It's not complicated, it's just hard because it requires honesty about capabilities and commitment about effort. Most people fail because they optimize for comfort now instead of function later. Don't be most people. Subscribe if you're part of the 0.1% who actually builds instead of just talks. Drop a comment with your biggest challenge in assembling your 5-person team. What role do you fill? What role is your biggest gap? Let's workshop this.